On December 25th, 2021, when many of us were opening our Christmas gifts, a man named Robert Maudsley received the worst possible news. One last time, his request to get released from his underground glass cell was denied. He would spend the rest of his days alone, as he had done for almost 60% of his life. But how did this man become one of the country's most notorious prisoners and earn the nickname Hannibal the Cannibal in the first place? Let's find out. Born in Toxteth, Liverpool on June 26, 1953, Robert Maudsley was part of a big family. One of 12 children of a coalman, George Maudsley, and his wife, Jean. We do not know much about Robert's early years, but what we do know is unsettling, to say the least. By the time he was just 2 years old, Robert and his brothers Paul and Kevin and sister Brenda were taken away by Child Protection Services because their parents often neglected them. Paul later recalled this part of their lives was actually a pleasant one, saying, "We went to Nazareth House in Crosby, which was run by nuns. It was a brilliant place, and we all went to school up the road in Little Crosby. We were happy." During the 6 years that Robert and his siblings spent in the Nazareth House, they were a real family unit and looked upon the nuns as their parents. Which is not a surprise, as George and Dean never came to see their children, not until the very end of those 6 years. By that time, Robert and his siblings had already forgotten their birth parents. To them, George and Jean were strangers. Still, for one reason or another, when Robert was 8 years old, his parents decided it was a good idea to take him and his siblings back to live with them and all the other children they had at this point. Paul later said the situation was bizarre. To go from Nazareth House to sitting on a couch in a home with parents who didn't talk to them. The abuse came on gradually. But in the end, it was the only thing Robert knew. As he recalled, "All I remember from my childhood is the beatings. Once I was locked in my room for 6 months, and my father only opened the door to come in to beat me 4 to 6 times a day." On top of that, Robert also claimed his father sexually abused him. So even though all the details of what was going on in the Maudsley household are not known, it was not surprising that Child Services once again took Robert, and this time only Robert, from his parents, placing him in a foster home. George, being the wonderful father that he was, told the boy's siblings that their brother had died, so nobody visited him. Years later, at the age of 16, Robert had had enough of transferring from one foster home to another, so he fled to London. There, the teenager's life did not really turn for the better. Quite contrary. Robert soon found himself sleeping on the streets, using drugs, lots of them, and working as a rent boy or male prostitute to support his addiction. All the hardship eventually caused Robert to attempt suicide at least 3 times. As a result, he was finally forced to seek the psychiatric help that he probably needed a long time prior. To hospital staff, Robert told about voices he was hearing, ordering him to kill his parents. Still, as alarming as that sounds, nothing really came out of it, and Robert was back on the streets in no time. Looking back to this moment has haunted Robert ever since. If he had just listened to the voices inside his head, perhaps others would not have suffered in his hands. But they did, and 30-year-old John Farrell was the first one to go. John was a labourer living on a farm on the outskirts of the city. While John enjoyed the easygoing and private lifestyle, his wife had not been able to adapt to the countryside. So eventually, she left her husband and moved back to the city, which did not upset John too much. You see, now that his wife was out of the way, John was free to fulfill his sexual fantasies, which included other men. He began to visit the area of rent boys in London, pick up his favourites, and bring them back to his house. Soon enough, in 1974, John laid his eyes on 21-year-old Robert Maudsley. John really liked Robert, who was very polite and easy to talk to and whose appearance fit his type perfectly. The only issue John had was Robert's excessive drug use. But even that did not stop the two from having a relationship for 5 to 6 months, until something went horribly wrong. That evening, on March 14th, 1974, had been going like usual. The two men had arrived together at John's house and were quickly making out on the bed. However, this time John stopped and said he wanted to show Robert something, which was not an easy thing to do as Robert was so high that he almost could not even sit up straight. Nevertheless, John took a pile of photographs and showed them to Robert, saying, "These pictures, look at them. They are great. They really get me going. Don't you like nude pictures of boys?" Robert tried his best to look at the photos, slowly processing what he was seeing. Once his eyes started to work, he was able to tell the pictures portrayed young boys and men sexually pleasing John, or as he said, their daddy. John was describing his sick mementos very proudly, but Robert was not listening. The only thing he was paying attention to was the pain and fear in the faces of John's victims. The same pain and fear Robert had gone through in the hands of his own father. Robert was still revisiting his awful memories when John suddenly slapped him across the face and shouted, "I said, do you fucking hear me, boy?" That was a big mistake. Before he knew it, John was lying on the bed under Robert, who quickly looped a rope around his neck. John did not have a chance against Robert. He brought himself close to his victim's face and said the last words John Farrell would ever hear. "Was this what you wanted, Daddy?" Soon after, Robert surrendered himself to the police and was charged with murder. However, due to his history of abuse, several suicide attempts, and the fact that he was hearing voices, Robert was found unfit to stand trial and was sent to the Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane. But while Robert was sentenced to life in a mental health facility, in the end, he did not last there for long. For many offenders, imprisonment means the end of their criminal career. But in Robert's case, it was just a start. In 1977, Robert, together with another inmate, kidnapped and killed 26-year-old David Francis, a convicted sex offender and abuser. They had dragged their victim into an office room and barricaded themselves in. Robert continued to torture David for over 9 hours, while other prisoners and staff members had to listen to his desperate screams. It is unclear why nobody could stop the attack at any point during those 9 hours. Nevertheless, around 8 p.m., the screams stopped. Robert had finally strangled his victim to death. When David's body was later recovered, it was in horrible shape. Robert had literally ripped the man apart and smashed his head open, causing David's brain matter to be found all over the room. For that exact reason, the media was swift to put up headlines of a madman that had eaten pieces of his victim's brain. And as a result, Robert Maudsley was dubbed the real Hannibal the Cannibal. However, the truth is, there was not enough evidence to support the claim, and the whole story is most likely entirely sensationalized. Of course, that does not change the fact that Robert's second murder was extremely brutal, and this time he was found fit to stand the trial for what he had done. Robert was eventually convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to life in prison, which meant he could no longer stay in Broadmoor Hospital. Instead, Robert was transferred to Wakefield High Security Prison for dangerous offenders. Life in a regular prison did not fit Robert, not at all. He wanted to be sent back to Broadmoor, and in Robert's head, that would happen if he proved he really was insane. And to do that, he needed to kill more. And so, on the morning hours of July 28, 1978, Robert targeted a 46-year-old sex offender named Salvi Darwood, who he stabbed to death inside his own cell using a knife crafted from a canteen soup spoon. To make sure his victim was really dead, Robert tied a string around Salvi's neck and held it tight for several minutes before rolling his body under the bed. Afterward, Robert headed outside the yard and spotted his next victim, 56-year-old child molester William Roberts. Later that day, when William was having a nap, Robert sneaked into his cell and stabbed his fellow inmate on the back and neck. The first strikes were not immediately fatal, so William had time to turn around and ask, "What the hell are you doing?" However, he never got an answer as Robert just smiled and continued his attack, stabbing William in the chest, arms and face until he stopped moving. But as he had done with Salvi, Robert once again needed to overkill his victim. So, he took William's head into his hands and smashed it against the wall as hard as he could, over and over again, until there was no skull left anymore. When Robert finally stopped, William's face was unrecognizable. The bodies were discovered shortly after, and Robert was immediately placed in solitary confinement. After his second trial, he was convicted of the double murder and sentenced to 2 more life terms. But unlike he had hoped for, Robert was not sent back to a mental facility. Instead, he was first sent to Parkhurst Prison, where he was actually able to work with the prison psychiatrist, Dr. Bob Johnson. But for some unknown reason, Robert was soon transferred back to Wakefield. There, in 1983, prison officials decided that they could not keep Robert Maudsley, who at this point was known as Britain's most dangerous prisoner, within the general population. Their solution for the situation was to house Robert in what you could describe as a glass cage, a 2-cell unit that looks very eerily similar to the one seen in the movie The Silence of the Lambs. For almost 40 years, Robert had remained in that cell for 23 hours a day, only getting 1 hour of exercise. As you can guess, lack of human contact has been incredibly difficult for Robert. All I have to look forward to is further mental breakdown and possible suicide. I think that's what the authorities hope for. That way, the problem of Robert John Maudsley can be easily and swiftly resolved. Today, at the age of 68, Robert Maudsley is one of the longest-serving British prisoners. And after receiving the news on December 25, 2021, we know for sure he will stay in his glass cell until the end of his days. Many agree that Robert's story could have ended differently if he had just received the proper mental health care that he desperately needed. In addition, many have been against keeping a person, even a murderer, in solitary confinement for decades. That kind of punishment causes irrevocable damage to the human mind, which is the reason why it is too late for Robert Maudsley ever to be allowed to be among other prisoners again. They simply cannot take the risk. Thank you for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed my storytelling. If you did, please show your appreciation by liking this video, leaving a comment letting me know what you thought of it, and if you don't already, become a subscriber to my channel. This is my first attempt at doing a true crime type of story. If you would like to hear more of these types of stories, please let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching.